4th of July. I'm red. So, 244 years ago, this morning, 56 British citizens came together in a town called Philadelphia to sign one of the most important documents of all time. At least many of the original eyewitnesses claim it was on the 4th of July. There is some dispute about that. But one thing is certain. When they were finished that day, they were no longer British. They were Americans. They had pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to the forging of a new nation like none other, the most remarkable social experiment the world had ever seen, of which today we are heirs. Today, on the 244th anniversary of the founding of our nation, I want to talk to you a little bit about America. Now, I know we are in the midst of a great pain and woundedness right now, a great agony. It is difficult for some people to even consider the possibility of national goodness or virtue. But for the few minutes that I speak to you, I hope that you will open your minds to the higher view and think about America from the biblical perspective. I'm not going to tell you many things that you don't already know, but I hope that as you think about what I'm going to say, as a result, you will resolve to be grateful people and vigilant people and truthful people. Those three characteristics: gratefulness, vigilance, truthfulness. I'm going to begin and finish with stories this morning. Let me open with a personal one. One of my earliest childhood memories is of Washington, D.C. in the summertime. It was 1962, oppressively hot and humid. I was all of 5 years old. Dad had taken his young family on a vacation to see our nation's capital, and he was very nearly arrested when our tired old 58 Chevy vapor-locked on Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House, blocking traffic for blocks. I vaguely remember seeing enormous dinosaur skeletons in a place called the Smithsonian and feeling miserably hot, constantly thirsty, and terribly tired from endless walking. And I remember Dad dragging me up a mountain of granite stairs to see somebody called Abraham Lincoln in a giant echoey white castle. Didn't mean much to me then to see that stuff. But it meant a lot to Dad to be showing it to me because my father was in the first generation in his family to be born in America. Of course, I didn't know that at the time. If I had thought about it at all, I would have figured in my little 5-year-old brain, I would have figured, well, he's just my dad, and he's been here forever, and we're all just Americans. Much later, I would learn that his mother and father had emigrated from Germany before he was born. I would learn that Frank Pekar and Catherine Klein had come to a new nation from the old country because they had heard of the nobility and the goodness of this place called America and the opportunity afforded people here. And although they were very proud of their German heritage, they were prouder to become Americans. When they married and started a home of their own, they made it a rule that German would no longer be spoken within the four walls of their home. And so my father and his twin sister and his two older brothers grew up speaking only English. When World War II broke out, both of my dad's brothers served in the combat infantry in the bloody forests of Germany, fighting the Nazis, and they were proud to do it, even though they knew that fate might call upon them to give what Lincoln at Gettysburg called their last full measure of devotion. My father, only 13 years old at that time, was not old enough to enlist, and so he worked after school late into the evenings at the Goodyear factory assembling fuel pumps for B-24 bombers at 13 years old. From my earliest memories, he was proud to be an American. The bookends on the shelves in our home were brass eagles with the numerals 1776 engraved on them. An eagle carrying a furled flag was affixed to the gable end of our garage facing the street. A framed picture of Washington crossing the Delaware hung in our living room. In his desk drawers were signed letters from several presidents of the United States. He flew Old Glory on all the holidays from a pole in front of the house, permanently anchored by concrete in my mother's flower beds. In his later years, he took up wood carving, and his subjects were always his American heroes, Washington or Lincoln or Teddy Roosevelt, and his favorite Washington pose was of the great general as he knelt, praying for his troops during that awful winter at Valley Forge when they battled the British in the snow with no shoes. When I was in 4th grade, the school system began to modernize the curriculum. They came out with a thing called New Math. But what concerned Dad most was that his boys were no longer learning history in school. They were learning a thing called social studies. And Dad went up the chain of command all the way to the superintendent's office to argue his case that American school kids ought to be learning American history in school. He never missed voting in an election. He never, at least in my presence, complained about paying his taxes. Now, he was not ignorant about the dark blots in the record of this country, nor was he a redneck. But he loved this nation, and he passed on to me a deep respect for the principles that undergird it. We attended my niece's graduation from Seattle University a few years back. It was held in Key Arena over there in Seattle, and they opened with the audience singing the Star-Spangled Banner. Oh, say does that Star-Spangled Banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. I tell you, it still brings tears to my eyes to sing that anthem in a room with thousands of people singing. Why is that so? Because the United States of America is an exceptional nation. Now, if that sounds like trigger language to you this morning, please hear me out on this. Our nation was, as our greatest president said, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And the history of our nation is the story of we the people, the American people, struggling, sometimes even against one another, struggling to protect and honor and live up to that exceptional principle around which we have come together as a people. We haven't always gotten it right. But those principles have been our North Star now for about a quarter of a millennium. And although our record is far from unblemished, we have not been unblessed with success. And boatloads, literally, of people from all over the world are still making unbelievable sacrifices in order to come here, to this land. They are not coming to America just because it's another nation, just another country, some place to go where they can get free stuff. They come here because there is no other place like this anywhere in the world. For all its faults, it is still the best. And as another president once said, it is the last best hope for freedom in the world today. In his excellent book, Conscience and Its Enemies, Robert P. George tells the story of his immigrant family, in particular of his great aunt who came from Italy to settle in the coal mining town of Clarksburg, West Virginia. She came determined to avail herself of the opportunity to find a better life for her family. She had a son, John Solomon, who wanted to become a lawyer. He finished college, first in his family ever to do so, and then he completed a law degree at West Virginia University. Robert George writes, and I quote him here, The law school in those days was located on University Avenue in Morgantown near the center of the campus. It was a grand building that one entered by walking up a broad set of stairs. When my cousin's mother came to attend her son's graduation ceremony, she stopped to kneel and kiss each step as she ascended those stairs. Such was her gratitude. Of course, he writes, her son was thoroughly embarrassed by this display. My father, who was there, tells me that his cousin John turned to his mother at about the fourth step and pleaded, "Mom, please stop. You're acting like such an immigrant." Indeed, she was. Now, I'm sure some of you have either had experiences similar to the ones these stories illustrate, or your parents have had them. I remember Roland Blake in Squim telling us how his family prayed that they might be captured by the American soldiers during the waning days of the war in Germany, because if the Americans got them, they knew they would be safe and treated humanely. Not so with the Russians. So then, what is it that makes America so exceptional anyway? If you were to Google that, you would find that there are as many answers to that question as there are people eager to post. Some point to our economy and its proven track record to lift people from every nation on earth out of poverty, more than all other economic systems of every age combined. Some say it's technology. Some say it's entrepreneurship, or the spirit of generosity, or the standard of living, or military capability, or rugged individualism, or who knows what. I would suggest that those are more symptoms than they are root causes. Others would argue for the American system of laws and justice, or, and listen to this now, for the American concept of human rights, which is founded upon the idea that the basic rights we enjoy are universal and come not from governments, nor congresses, nor kings, but rather from a divine source. And here maybe we are coming closer to the real answer, because as you all know, our founding document declares that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. No other nation on the face of the earth has ever been founded on a principle like that at any time, in any age. And that's why our new nation was referred to as a most remarkable social experiment. It had never been done before. They didn't know whether it would last. And yet here we are. Happy birthday. 244 candles on the cake. Think about those rights for a moment. The right to life. The right not to be killed. It's one of the most basic rights you can imagine. It's kind of fundamental. The right to liberty, to live free from coercion, to exercise the power of choice, not only in economic and political matters, which is why so many of the immigrants to this nation found reason for intense gratitude and incentive to shoulder the responsibilities of this unique citizenship, but even more profound, liberty of conscience in matters of faith. Thomas Jefferson put it this way: the constitutional freedom of religion is the most inalienable and sacred of all human rights. Why is that? Well, it's because Jesus Christ went to the cross and died to guarantee human beings a free choice, a response based on love of who they would worship. Such liberty is foundational to the divine government of the whole universe. Freedom to worship was the bottom line driving force that brought the pilgrims to this continent in the first place. You all know that. Even though they didn't get it perfect either, it was the driving force. Jefferson understood that. And he wasn't even a practicing Christian, according to how most folks would describe practicing Christians today. Freedom of worship is one of the bedrock reasons that America is an exceptional nation, but it doesn't end there. Psalm 33 has relevance for what we are talking about today. The whole passage that Daniel read for us is relevant, but verse 12 is what we'll look at here. In verse 12 it says, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people He chose for His inheritance." Now, when this was written, of course, the immediate application would have been to the nation of Israel, God's people, who He refers to frequently as my chosen inheritance. But the wider application is not difficult to catch here. Any nation, any collection of people bound together by the contracts of government will find themselves blessed if the undergirding principles of that government reflect the principles of the divine government. The principles of the divine government are those which are conducive to life and success and prosperity and peace, because the author of those principles is the author of life. He is the giver of success and prosperity. He is the bringer of peace. He is the inventor and the designer and the builder of it, okay? So He knows what works best and what does not work because He made it. And so the bottom line is this: America is exceptional because of our Christian pedigree. Our success is but a natural outgrowth of that. On the other hand, nations whose guiding principles and operating values are antagonistic to or contradictory to those of the divine government generally don't turn out so well. Again, consider Soviet Russia for an example, a nation undergirded by the godless claims of atheism. That nation didn't turn out so well, nor was it ever a blessing to its people. Boatloads of immigrants never sailed for asylum in Soviet Russia. Citizens of nations such as these, at least the common masses, are not usually prosperous and satisfied. They are not usually quick to express gratitude for their governments. I have a friend who emigrated from the Ukraine. His mother came to spend some months with him several years ago, and she came to church with him every week, even though she understood not a single word of English. But after the worship service on Veterans Day, she had tears on her face, and I asked my friend to find out from her what made her weep. And he said that she had never before seen people who had such love for their nation, who expressed such gratitude for their nation and affection for their country. And she had not even understood anything that had been said that morning, but she could understand it as she watched the people's faces. She could see it in their hearts. People in Russia would never feel this way, she said. So the Bible is clear that nations which operate based on Christian principles will be blessed. They just will be. But America has been especially blessed, and it was foretold in Scripture. So, the book of Revelation, in chapter 13 and verse 11, there is a prophetic description of a nation that many good Bible scholars believe to be the United States. All right, it's not working. Forward to slide. Blank slide. Need a blank slide, right? There, good. We need a new one of these. In chapter 13 and verse 11, there is a prophetic description of a nation that many good Bible scholars believe points to the United States. The symbolism used is straightforward. Nations represented by beasts, political power represented by horns. The geographical origin corresponds correctly. This nation comes up out of the earth, a relatively uninhabited place, in contrast to the sea, which is representative of multitudes. The chronological timeline is also correct for a nation coming into existence toward the end of the 18th century. And the verse is Revelation 13 and verse 11. Then I saw another beast coming out of the earth. He had 2 horns, like a lamb. Here's where the interpretation sometimes gets sloppy, okay? People say, okay, a lamb-like nation. What is a lamb like? Well, lambs are docile. Lambs are meek. Lambs are mild. They are all kinds of things, but none of that means anything. Revelation is a book loaded with symbolism, but the symbols must be understood properly. Every single place Revelation talks about a lamb, it is talking about Jesus. Jesus is the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Jesus is the Lamb on the throne. Jesus is the Lamb worthy to receive worship. He is the Lamb able to open the scroll. There are 28 references to the Lamb in Revelation. Every single one of them refers to Jesus. So here's what Revelation is telling us in this verse. This nation, our nation, was founded on the principles of Jesus. It is a lamb-like beast, a Jesus-like beast. It is undergirded by truth, the truth that we would call Christianity. Now, there's a lot of pushback against this today. People say, the United States was never a Christian nation. And you know what? They are absolutely right. America was never intended to be a Christian nation. Our forefathers were desperately fleeing Christian nations when they came here in the first place. Isn't that true? That is true. They set this government up specifically to guard against a Christian nation. And when we say Christian nation, we mean a nation with laws requiring adherence to Jesus Christ and His teachings. Iran is a country that requires from its citizens adherence to the Prophet Muhammad. Islam, its very name means submission, requires submission to the Quran, to Muhammad, to Allah, on pain of severe punishment. You can't even be killed over there if you won't comply. And so Iran is a Muslim nation. American government was designed to secure for its citizens the right of religious liberty so that its people can freely choose to worship Jesus as a gratitude response for His uncountable blessings, as a love response for His sacrifice that John says has bought us all the right to become children of God, as an adoration response for His goodness and His beauty. Or they can choose not to worship or to worship some other god. We are not a Christian nation, but this nation was founded upon Christian principles. And that fact is so obvious, it shouldn't even require a debate. Nearly half the signers of the Declaration of Independence had seminary or theology degrees. Did you know that? I have some quotes from a few of the founders, and I'm going to be writing as you leave this morning. I've got them here and you can have them. But listen to some of these. This is from John Adams. He was crystal clear on this. Advance one. The general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity, he wrote. Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. Advance the slide, please. Benjamin Rush was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He understood this. He said, "The only foundation for a republic is to be laid in religion. Without this, there can be no virtue, and without virtue, there can be no liberty. And liberty is the object and life of all republican governments." By republican there, he doesn't mean Republican or Democrat. He means that we are a republic. We are not a democracy. George Washington was crystal clear on this. He wrote, "No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency." And now advance for me there, Mike. "We ought to be no less persuaded that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained." That's pretty amazing, isn't it? That was from his first inaugural address, by the way. And he also said this, I quote, "It is impossible to rightly govern the world without God and the Bible." End quote. That's pretty clear, I think. And Lincoln said some things too, and we're going to come to those in just a moment. But you know these things, right? You know them. God has shed His grace on this country, and we have been blessed beyond our ability to comprehend it. And our nation has prospered because we are a Christian principled nation. A Christian principled nation. But, advance please, Mike. The prophecy also says that this lamb-like beast speaks as who? Yeah, one more. Speaks like a dragon. That's right. The dragon is also a symbol, and Revelation is quite clear about the interpretation of the dragon symbol. He is named that old serpent called the devil and Satan. Now here's the interesting thing. Notice what the lamb-like beast does. What does the lamb-like beast do here in this verse? He speaks. Yeah, he speaks. We tend to like to jump ahead to verse 13, where the lamb-like dragon speaking beast that stands for the United States mimics another beast and compels worship on penalty of death. We like to talk about that, but that's not what he does first. What he does first is speak. He uses words like a dragon. Like a dragon. In other words, he speaks like Satan speaks. So here's the question. How does Satan speak? Liar. Yes, he is. Jesus was not even a little bit ambiguous about this. Go ahead, Mike. This is what Jesus said to a group of religious hecklers one day. He said, "You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out his desire. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies." So what's the native language of Satan? Lies. Yeah, he speaks lies. Always has, always will. Now, you talk about a black-white contrast here. You've got one. On the one hand, lamb-like beast. On the other hand, dragon. On the one hand, Jesus. On the other hand, Satan. On the one hand, truth, because remember, Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." On the other hand, lies, which are distortions of truth, because Jesus said lies are Satan's native tongue. So what do you think the dragon lies about anyway? What does he lie about? Well, on the one hand, you have a nation founded upon the guiding principles of the divine government, the teachings of Jesus. Chief among them is the freedom of conscience in the matter of worship. And on the other hand, you have an effort to undermine those principles, those bedrock truths, with lies. The lies are about God. They always have been. Because the dragon wants to slander God. The dragon wants God out of the picture. Okay? The dragon wants Jesus out of the picture. Remember that. So, you can go ahead and advance to the next black one, Mike. Thank you. So if you are thinking about the practical application here, then you will be thinking about this question. Does the United States speak like a dragon in an official sense? Well, let's consider a few legal statements put forth by our courts. And these are just a couple representative examples, okay? In the matter of the sanctity and dignity of human life, we're fighting right now over this idea of Black Lives Matter, aren't we not? We are. Do they matter? Of course they do. But from the perspective of God, all lives are valuable, are they not? Why do human lives matter? Why? Why is it that human lives matter more than, say, the lives of earthworms? That's exactly right. That is exactly right. It is because the idea that human beings are made in the image of God, all right? That's what gives human beings dignity. You can't get dignity from any other place. The atheistic people cannot come up with human dignity. It's not available. It comes because we're made in the image of God. And you know that the right to life is the first inalienable human right named in the Declaration of Independence. What have the courts said about the right to life? Well, they have spoken on this. They have declared that nothing is special, nothing is sacred, nothing is worthy of protection in the case of unborn human life, and the tragedy and the moral stain on the soul of this nation is because of the lie, is because of that lie, and it is heartbreaking. Over 70 million innocents have been slaughtered over the past 70 years, millions of them viable, fully formed, ready to take up their lives as human beings. The lie that the unborn children are not really human beings at all. That's the lie, that they're not really human. They're just tissue. They don't matter. Those lives don't matter. Or consider the truth of marriage. The court has spoken, and in so doing has denied the truth of marriage as a fundamental Christian principle and foundational unit of the family. And by the way, let me just say something else here. There is a myth held dearly by our culture that goes something like this. If you don't support gay marriage, you are therefore against gay people. That's just not true. That is a lie. Right? There is no rational reason for that myth. There may be an emotional basis for it, but it's just not true. I have a very dear friend who has chosen to unite with her partner in what she believes is a gay marriage. She has been a close friend of mine and my wife's for half of our lifetime. She will continue to be very dear to us. We love her. God loves people. God is not against people. God is for people. He loves all of us sinners. But it does not logically follow that to be for people, to love people, you must therefore deny truth or neglect truth. That's just plain wrong-headed thinking. And please remember this as well. Even though our nation has officially embraced these two examples of dragon doctrine, the mission of the church is still the same. Our calling is to love people, to introduce them to Jesus, to help them become His followers. In the face of bad law, nothing has changed about that. Nothing has been compromised as far as our mission is concerned. So those are a couple of examples of how I believe the dragon has spoken. But here's the good news. The context of Revelation 13 is not primarily about the sanctity of life or about marriage. It is about worship. It is about God's existence and His goodness and His creative acts and whether we will choose to worship Him on that basis. And at this time in history, we still have unbelievable freedom to follow and honor and worship God. We do. And as far as liberty of conscience goes, our nation still speaks like a lamb today. And that's good news. The day will come when that window of freedom will close, and it may be closer than we think. But that day is not this day. So while we still live in the land of the free and the home of the brave, let's stay on task. Let's do what God put us here to do, to love people, to introduce them to Jesus, and help them become His followers. And let's tell the truth. Let's tell the truth. Because that's what Jesus does. The dragon lies. The Lamb speaks truth. So I began with a story, and I'm going to finish with a story now. Advance one slide there for me, Mike. That'll be the last slide. It comes again from Robert P. George's book, Conscience and Its Enemies. George is one of America's most respected, conservative legal thinkers by people on both ends of the spectrum. He is a conservative thinker, but he is respected and admired by many on the liberal end of the spectrum because he's a kind man and he's a clear thinker. He's not an emotional thinker. He's a rational thinker. He is the Robert McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton, the same post once held by President Woodrow Wilson. He is a visiting professor at Harvard Law, a recipient of the Presidential Citizens Medal, holder of many honorary doctoral degrees, and he writes extensively on the subject of liberty of conscience. Although this book is not an easy read, if you choose to attempt it, I don't think you'll be disappointed. All right, you can advance, Mike. I'm going to preface his story by telling you that, like my father, I too drugged my children to Washington at young ages. And we went back frequently as they were growing up because we lived there on the East Coast, not far away. And as I have grown older, that magnificent, almost sacred temple enshrining the memory of Abraham Lincoln has become most dear to me. 5 years ago, when we knew we were going to move west, Colette and I decided to make one final visit there, and we took Amelia, our youngest, with us to see Mr. Lincoln one last time. We climbed those same steps that my father had drugged me up a half a century before. And we stood before the great solitary marble statue late in the evening, near closing time, when the visitors were few in number, and when we would be undisturbed by the careless chatter and parents dragging their tiny children. It's my favorite time to visit there. And she and I stood side by side, and we read the words of his second inaugural address. They're carved in the granite there. And then we turned and we walked to the south alcove, and we read the words of the oration that is considered to be the finest American speech ever given, the Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. 10 short sentences. This address is the subject of the chapter in George's book entitled God and Gettysburg. And now I'll tell you that story. It was at a conference at Princeton that George picked up a pamphlet containing a printed copy of America's 3 founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Gettysburg Address. They were published in pamphlet form by the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy, a very influential and fairly left-leaning organization. Having memorized Lincoln's speech as a child, George noticed upon reading it in the pamphlet that something didn't quite ring true. He reread the final paragraph. It is rather for us, the living, to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to the cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, for the people, and by the people, shall not perish from the earth. Strange, he thought. Something's wrong. And then he figured it out. 2 words had been omitted. 2 words. Under God. What Lincoln actually said at Gettysburg was this: that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. The American Constitution Society had removed Lincoln's reference to the United States as a nation under God. Now, that could have been an innocent error, or it could have been purposeful. A kind of apex of secular, godless ideology that has attained such a high status that nothing is sacred anymore, as it were, not even the facts of American history, not even the words spoken by Abraham Lincoln at the most solemn ceremony of our nation's history. When the atheist Michael Newdow challenged in court the inclusion of the words "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance, he argued that the words were not included in the original pledge created in the 1920s, but that Congress had added them in the 1950s during the era of the Cold War to distinguish the roots of America from those of Soviet Russia. What Newdow avoided to mention was that those 2 words, under God, were not taken from some Billy Graham sermon. They were taken from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. That fact is a little inconvenient for those who hold that Christianity has no place in the founding of our nation. And the description of America as a nation under God have no basis in truth because our founders sought a strict separation of church and state. But this puts the American Constitution Society in a sticky position. In assembling its pamphlet, it was eager to include Lincoln as a founder, but the great emancipator's characterization of the United States as a nation under God kind of undermines what the left is trying to do, and its claim that God has no place in the public sphere. What to do? Well, the society chose simply to take the 2 offending words out. In other words, they lied. They lied. But here's the thing about lies. Their deviousness and destructiveness often lies, pardon the pun, in their subtlety. And here, George says, the plot thickens. First, the society knew it would get a certain level of immunity because its liberal secularist viewpoint is overwhelmingly the viewpoint of American legal academics, in fact, most academics in general. Second, the society knew that they could muddy the water if they were ever accused of altering the historical documents for ideological reasons by claiming that, in fact, there are 5 extant copies of the Gettysburg Address in Lincoln's hand, and 2 of them do not include the words "under God." But that doesn't wash, because the copy universally accepted as the most authoritative, known as the Bliss copy, which is the only one with Lincoln's signature, it does include the words. And because none of the other known written copies are exactly what Lincoln said that day. As it happens, we know exactly what he said that day, because 3 entirely independent newspaper reporters, including one from the Associated Press, telegraphed They're transcriptions of Lincoln's remarks to their editors immediately after the President spoke. All three of those transcriptions are identical, and all three include the words, "under God." There really isn't room for equivocation or evasion. Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, one of the founding texts of the American Republic, expressly characterizes the United States as a nation under God. And as it turns out, Robert George was not the only person who noticed it that day. And under pressure, the Constitution Society amended later publications to introduce the words Hayes Draft, referring to the least authoritative of the 5 written copies, and ironically, the one containing the most significant variations to what Lincoln actually said that day. In other words, leaving out the words "under God" was not a mistake. It was deliberate. It was calculated. These kinds of groups know exactly what they are doing to achieve the results they want, and they violate not only scholarly consensus, but common sense. And, as George says with a twinkle in his pen, the memorization of generations of school children. In such seemingly innocent ways, the dragon's voice speaks, and he works to embed the lie, to achieve the result, to marginalize Jesus, to deny God and his principles of government. So, what do I hope you'll take from all this? I hope that you will be, first of all, grateful people that you live in America. Of all the people living in the world from every age, we are the most blessed. When we have privilege like this, guilt is not an appropriate response. Generosity is, and thankfulness. You could just as easily be living in a place called Saudi Arabia or Ethiopia or Nepal or Venezuela. You could. Instead, heaven has smiled upon you and you live here in this country. What kind of a kindness did God bestow on this? Why did he do that? I don't know. But ought not our first response to be gratitude? Shouldn't we be thankful people? Of course it's far from perfect. Of course there are dark stains on our national character. But as a nation ordered on the principles that echo those of heaven, she has been most blessed by God. Second, I hope you will be vigilant people. The knowledge base is miles wide today, but barely a quarter-inch deep. And a lot of it is just plain wrong. And just because somebody says it's so doesn't make it so. Just because it's on Facebook or Twitter or some big-shot Hollywood celebrity said it doesn't make it so. There's a whole lot of dragon speak going on today. I challenge you to know why God has given us liberty, to realize how much it cost him, and to defend it kindly but firmly. Because in the words of the American Civil Liberties Union, freedom can't defend itself. And finally, speak truth. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, to borrow a phrase from Lincoln, but the battle lines are no longer drawn between North and South. They are drawn between truth and lies. Every time we speak, we can choose whether to use lamb-like words or dragon-like words. So I hope that you will be grateful, vigilant, and truthful. Let's sing whatever you have prepared for us, Greg.